looked at our lives and how we live. We can get rid of things. We can live without certain stuff. We can just live with simpler ideas and concepts. We've talked about our time and how we monopolize it with a lot of stuff that doesn't need to be there. We last week looked at even how do we live simpler with our stuff, and Palmer challenged us to just go through our closets and get rid of stuff. For me, all of this is my love language. Like, I love the concept of living simpler, going smaller, leaving a smaller imprint on this earth. My wife and I even got to the point where, like, let's figure out how do we raise our own meat and our own vegetables, and how can we live in a smaller house. And so for the past 20 years, this has been just a deep desire to figure out how can we live simpler. Today we're looking at debt. How do we live with less debt, and how does that bring us more freedom? And as soon as you see the word debt or hear the word debt, some of you, your stomach kind of tightened a little bit. Your pulse rate went up. Your spouse tapped you on the shoulder and just said, listen. Debt's a hard word. It's like a word that we don't talk about in church oftentimes. But it has a way, in my opinion, of getting a grip on like your soul and down deep into who you are as a person. What it does is it holds you and it says, I'm going to prevent you from doing more with your life. See, for me, one of my favorite things is coming up in 3 weeks. Every year we go to Malawi, and I bring a team of people with me, and I get to watch their lives transformed. You see, they go there with all these expectations and hopes and desires and thoughts of how they're going to change the world. And then they sit in the third poorest country in the world and realize, wait, they have more hope than I do and more joy. And I have 10 times the possessions, but they have 10 times the life that I do. And if you're going to remember anything today, I would encourage you to write down June 2020. And make a commitment to go to Malawi next year with us as a church. Like, what if all of us went? How amazing would that be? I'll tell you what, though, I feel like this church already does some pretty cool things that would radically transform us. You see, when you sit with them, you realize as you're getting on the plane to come back home, I watch our team every year. They're weeping because they realize they have so much stuff. They're going back to these closets that are full of shoes and clothes and garages that are just packed full of junk with cars and boats and just all of this stuff. And none of those things are necessarily wrong. But when they occupy all of your soul, they're wrong. You see, when I first went to Malawi, I was concerned that I wouldn't have enough stuff. And so I packed this 50-pound suitcase. It really is 50 pounds. And I packed it full of my stuff because I was like, you know what? I don't know what's coming up. I'd never been to Africa before. Even though I grew up around the world, I'm like, I just don't know. And so I put stuff in there. I had 7, 8 pairs of shoes. I had sweatshirts. I had coats. I had tons of shirts and pants and just stuff. And I realized as I'm putting it in and taking it off my bed, I realized I can't fit it all in there. So I get a roll-on. So I take my carry-on and I packed this thing completely full and had to actually do the expander so I could fit it all in there. And I still had stuff. So I grabbed my backpack. And I fit this in it, and I thought, worst case scenario, I need to have a couple days worth of clothes in here in case my stuff gets lost, and then I can survive for at least 2 days. And so I packed all of this. And at the end of the trip, I realized I didn't use half that stuff. And I made a commitment. Next year, I'm not bringing a suitcase. So the year later, I start packing and getting ready to go. And I start packing up my stuff, and I realize, okay, maybe I'll just use the suitcase. And then once the suitcase was full, I realized I still have stuff. Like, what if I need this? And so I packed on the roll-on, and I got on the plane exactly like I did the year before. And again, I realized I don't need all this stuff. And so what I did is I said, okay, next year I'm not going to do this. I did it again. This last year, I went to Thailand for 2 weeks in January, and this is all I brought. Like, I can live for weeks, months now. 2 pairs of pants, 2 shirts, 2 button-up shirts, a few other items, and laundry detergent. Honestly, I can live for months. 2 pairs of shoes, flip-flop, swimming suit, and I'm good to go. And it was so transformative for me to realize, wait, I can And it was scary, I'll be honest with you. It was scary getting on with the plane. I showed up at the airport, my team was like, what are you doing? I'm like, I don't know, figuring it out. Did you know that I had a pair of pants and 2 shirts that I didn't even wear? I'm gonna simplify a little more. But what I've realized through this process for me of traveling is I carry around too much stuff with me just in case. Just in case, like what if I need that? And then each time I come home, I look in my garage and I look in my house and I realize there's too much stuff. And this is who we are as Americans. We walk through life dragging this stuff around because what if I need it? We have that extra credit card because just in case. We have that extra amount of stuff just we might need it. We have those extra amount of clothes because what if it gets too hot or too cold? What if? But what if you realize that you don't need this? You know, when you look in Scripture, how does God call us to live? There's 2,500 verses in the Bible that talk about your money and your possessions. And almost all of them say, get rid of it. When Jesus talked in the parables more about your money and your possessions than he ever did about love. And yet we don't talk about this too often, and we feel like it's taboo. I was reading an article this week. I was going through Yahoo, and an article popped up on debt. They're listening. People are always listening somehow. I don't know how, but this article pops up on debt when I'm studying about debt. And the article said that 42% of Americans have so much debt that they don't know when they're ever going to get out of it. And then it said 65% of Americans believe that they will die with debt. I mean, think about that. That's this right here. That's that amount of our population says, yeah, not only do I have debt, but I have so much debt, I'm never getting out of it. You see, I sat in that place deep. I dug myself in such a hole that I couldn't get out. I mean, it was unbelievable. And I think oftentimes I have a tendency to come up because after this Enneagram series, I realized as a 7, I only talk about the good things in my life. But in reality, you have to go to the bad things and the hard things. And so when I look at debt, that is a topic for me that I never in a million years thought I'd be able to talk about, because I was so gripped in it. You see, when I was in college, I remember they sent me a Visa card, and all I saw was $1,500 limit, which meant, hurry up, you can spend $1,500. Like, this is free money. These people are idiots sending me a card. Little I didn't know that we needed to reverse that. And then after college, I started a construction company, and it started making money, and I've shared parts of this story, but the other part of the story, the rest of the story, is the more money I made, the more money I spent. And the more money I spent, the more successful I looked. And the more successful I looked, the more I felt at peace with myself or who I thought I was. And I realized that I began this journey down this path of trying to fulfill who I was by just being known, by being respected, by having my friends come to me and say, Paul, you're doing good, I'm proud of you. By having my parents come and tell me, Paul, you're killing it, you're doing a great job. At the same time, I'm making, as a 25-year-old kid, making like $20,000 a month, spending like $30,000 a month, having 20-some employees. Like, everything was great. But at the same time, there was this wall on both sides of me. Picture crossing the Red Sea, except it's not good. And I knew all of this debt was here. And I knew all these creditors were standing by. And I knew all of my credit cards were getting maxed out. I even knew the government was potentially looking for me. And yet I still was like, I'm doing great, I'm doing good. And every time I came home, I'd tell my wife about the new contract, the new work, the new things that were going on, the amount of money I was making, it was all good. And then, as they all do, the wall eventually fell. I remember sitting at home and watching my wife get a phone call. And I can tell by her face, this isn't good. And she's just looking at me with that look that every guy in this room potentially has experienced at one point. And she got off the phone and she says, that was the IRS. They said you owe $40,000. Maybe they're confused. The next day, the Oregon Department of Revenue called and said, you owe $25,000. The next day, Workman's Comp called and said, you owe $15,000. In 3 days' time, there was a reality of $80,000 of debt. And it started to grip on my soul. And it was painful, and it was embarrassing. And I was hurt, and I realized that I had just made a mess. And I didn't want anyone to know, because what if they didn't think that I was important anymore? What if they lost confidence in me or belief in me? And so I started to wrestle with this. And honestly, it was as if a chain was tied around my ankle, and I'm on a boat and somebody just threw that chain and that anchor off. And this debt of the IRS and these debt of these bills, over $150,000 in debt, not including my house, as a 25-year-old kid. And it was just pulling me under. And I remember sitting there and just this idea of, what do I do? So I did what every good Christian did. I prayed. I'm like, God, please help me. Send somebody to rescue me. Bring somebody to bring me out of this debt. Help an organization to come alongside me and buy me out, or a church to invest in my business, because maybe the churches do that. I don't know. I was reaching out for anything. This is how financially sound I was. Well, the Lord can use the lottery, and so every single week, as I'm broke, there were weeks I collected cans in Oregon to have enough money to buy a lottery ticket, because maybe God would use that. That'd be an amazing story. I'll give him all the glory. It's a whole new level of stupid. I can say that, you can't. And I honestly really believed that would happen. And I remember when I realized I can't do this. Like I can't pull up the anchor. Like I'm driving around a truck in 1995 that was the biggest thing you can ever imagine. And I was paying $500 a month, not including my insurance. And it was a lease. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. It's pulling me down. And a bill would come in every single day and they'd pull me down. And just all of these things, it had a grip on me. I was reading this last week, or listening to Andy Stanley. If anything I'm saying this morning resonates with you, go on YouTube, type in Andy Stanley, guardrails, money, and watch that sermon. And one of the things that he said, he says, do we have money, or does money have us? Do we own it, or does it own us? Do we possess and use it, or does it possess and use us? And if you could have read that to me back then, I would have said, yeah, money has me. It owns me, it possesses me. Like, how do I get free from this? How do I get out of this bondage? And I sat there in that mess and struggled through questions like that. He then went on to say this. He said, greed is the assumption that it's all for my consumption. If it shows up in my hands, it's for me. If it ends up in my bank account, it's for me. If it goes into my 401k, it's for me. If it's part of my inheritance, then it's for me. It's all for my consumption. If I choose to give this to someone or something else, then God better be watching. When you live this way, you are living as if there is no God. It's about me now, and it's about me later. Such a powerful statement. From the world's standpoint, I had it. I was crushing it. From God's standard, I was completely backwards. So I sat in that for a season of life and realized I need to get help. Like an alcoholic will go to AA, a drug addict goes to rehab. What does somebody who's just epically stupid do? Like, honestly, like, what do I do? And so I started reaching out. I sat with my wife, and I'm like, what do we do? And so I started reaching out to people in my church. I had one guy come up to me, and he says, well, there's a verse in James chapter 1, verse 2. It says, consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. Thanks. Next person. Honestly, another guy came up to me and said, Romans 5 says, rejoice in your sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Well, then I can probably run 15 marathons in a row, because help. So I sat with my pastors, my elders, my parents, my in-laws. And every single time I just said, hey, here's where I'm at. What do I do? And every single one of them said, make a list. And so my wife, Mel, and I made a list. And this past week, I was going through my journals, and I found that list. And I reread some of those journal entries, and man, it brought back some memories that I don't ever want to go through again. And at the top of the list, IRS, 40 grand, Oregon Department, 25,000, save 15,000, there's 80,000 right there, $20,000 credit line to US Bank, Advanta Visa card, 19.24%, $7,720. Citibank Visa, 21.55%, $1,500. I had a Sears card. Not only did I have a Sears card, but I maxed out my Sears card at $1,500 at 21% interest. Like, why in the world would I go to Sears and max it out? Capital One, 16.51%, $3,654.33, and it says, due now, a payment of $354.33. MBNA, whatever that is, 18.9%, $1,442.05. I could keep reading for a while. Like, I read this and I'm like, oh, this brings back such horrible memories. So I went back to the people and I said, I made a list. And they said, put it in order from the lowest to the highest. The lowest amount that you owe to the highest amount you owe. And so I did that, and they said, double it. I'm like, what do you mean? They said, double your lowest payment and pay that till it's paid off. And then take all that money and put it on your next payment and double that. And then keep doing that for as long as it takes. In the handout, it talks about Dave Ramsey. Honestly, go to Dave Ramsey, go to YouTube, type in Dave Ramsey Money Church Talk. Like, he's got all kinds of stuff. We have classes here at the Grove. If any of this resonates, you need to be in one of those classes. But I've lived through all this. I listened to one of his sermons 4 times this last week just because I feel like it's such good teaching. His books and everything pours into it. And so for 7.5 years, we made payments. But you know what it was like? That chain around my ankle with that anchor that was thrown overboard, it was as if a whole group of us started pulling it up together. I was making the payments with my wife, but I had people standing alongside me saying, we're here for you. You know, the second thing I realized, getting help means I have to get out. I have to figure out how to get out of debt. And I have to do anything and everything it takes to get out of debt. So we collected all of those credit cards, we put them on the table, and we cut them up. Anything you hear online on getting out of debt, that's the first thing they'll say. Cut up your credit cards. And then we looked at what are the other things that we can get out of our house. You see, when a ship is sinking, the sailors used to take the stuff and just huck it overboard. Because either we live without that stuff or we die with it. And so we went through all of our possessions and we thought, what can we get rid of? And so the first thing is we looked out the window and we looked at my giant truck and we're like, we gotta get rid of it. And by we mean me. And so I got in the truck and I drove it up to the dealer. I did it on a 2-year lease where you could only drive like 4 miles a day or you're over. And so just driving it home and back, you're upside down. And so I took it in and I drove into the lot and I found the same guy that sold it to me. It's like 6 months later. I'm like, hey, I need to return this truck. He goes, no, you can't. You signed it. He goes, plus you're upside down. And I said, well, then turn it over and take it. Because I can't afford this. This is foolishness. And it took a while. I think I had to get a loan through my dad at like low interest. Should have been 0. He'll watch this later. But I got out of the truck. We got rid of it. We had garage sales. We'd sold stuff. We eliminated anything and everything that wasn't tied down. And we began to move forward. You have to eliminate and downsize. I read this week, it says, how many times have you gone out to eat or bought clothes or even taken a vacation that you could not afford and borrowed the money through plastic purchases? That's how I lived. I'm just going to charge this because I'm going to earn points and I'll pay for it next month because I'm going to make even more next month. Do we ever even use those points? I mean, it's just absolutely, if you don't have the cash, don't buy it. Like, what do you think they did before like 1920? They had cash and then they'd buy. And that's just, for some reason, we feel obsessed that we have to keep up with the people around us. So we keep charging and we keep charging. And I'll say to you, if you're under 30, it's a trap. the Visa card, should you have one? Sure. I just found out yesterday, I thought I haven't had a card for like 20 some years. My wife apparently has one hidden in the drawer, but she doesn't tell me about it. I mean, it's probably smart. I tried to find it, I couldn't. You know, the last statement for me, get help, get out, is to go. You see, for me, I was go. Like, go, exclamation mark. I'm going. This is what I'm doing. Get on if you want, but I'm buying this. I'm going here. I'm making that happen. And as you're doing that, you're running through life trying to patch up all the mess that you're making. So then I switched to go, period. Which meant, like, maybe I should do this. I think I should do that. But when you get to this concept of go, question mark, it's a question that you're having to ask every time you make a purchase, every time you go someplace, every time you go out to eat, every time you go on vacation. Is this something I should be doing? See, Andy Stanley talks about, we pray for our money when our backs are against the wall. And I didn't just pray, I screamed, like, God, I need help. Send someone to rescue me. But I realized, what if I stopped praying at that point of being in danger and I started praying for everything that was in front of me? What if I started praying for my purchases, my lifestyle, everything? Like, what if it says in the Bible, it says pray without ceasing? What if I actually did that? A couple years ago, I came back from Malawi and I decided, I'm going to live like they do and I'm going to go a year without buying anything, meaning clothing and shoes. And so every time I needed something or wanted something, what I realized later, I'd pray for it. And most of the time I didn't get it, but I remember it was like November and it was getting cold and I didn't have a coat for some reason. And I went to go online, I went to purchase, I'm like, I have to pray for this. And so I prayed for a coat. And it felt really weird and awkward, but I'm like, Lord, I'm cold, I need a coat. Like, what do you do with that, And so I got up that next morning, I'm like, I don't have a coat, so I put on a hoodie, and I came into work, and as I was driving into the coffee shop, I go to get a coffee. Lawrence Jarvie worked there at the time, and he just says, hey, before you say anything, I'm sorry, this is so weird. I was getting dressed this morning, I put on my coat, and it was as if God was speaking to me. He said, give your coat to Paul. You're gonna think I'm crazy, I know. I'm sorry, but I gotta be obedient. Here you go. And I stood there, and it was as if the Red Sea literally parted in front of me as he's holding this coat. I'm like, pray without ceasing. Pray for all things. Go. And it floored me. We have this concept that God doesn't care about this stuff, but in reality, God is such in the detail that he desperately wants you to bring him into those places. For me, when I look back now, 2019, looking back to 1995, never in a million trillion years did I think I would ever be standing on a stage like this. But you see what that did? That 7.5 years of paying that debt back slowly softened my heart and changed my soul and helped me to understand God really does want me to bring him into these details. You see, I'd still been going through life a lot with hauling these things around and understanding I don't need those things. Not only do I not need those things, but I need to live differently. And so I started volunteering at my church in the high school ministry. Then I started pouring into the junior high ministry. And then I realized I have a passion for this. And so I walked away from my business career. And I got a paper route. And I started throwing papers because the church wouldn't pay me at the time. And it was humbling and it was embarrassing, but I was able to work and serve with kids. And if I compare it to this, man, I'll take a year of delivering papers and have to relive this again. And sometimes God brings you places. For example, in debt. I don't believe he brought me there, I brought myself there, but sometimes he allows you to slowly crawl out of that so you can shift your view from what used to be this obsession with what others think and finances and keeping up with all those other people around you to, God, what do you want from me? Where do you want me to go? How do you want me to serve you? How can I release this bondage? Andy Stanley was talking about with his kids. He says one of the things he does with his kids is when they get their allowance, he has 3 jars out for them. The first jar simply says, give. And that could be the church, that could be missions, that could be whatever. And so their kids take their allowance and they put a portion of it in the give jar. And then there's another jar that says save. And they put a little bit in the save jar. And then the third jar says live. He says that's what they're allowed to live off of. He goes, we do that with our kids and we tell them to tithe. And the beautiful thing that I just found last night as I was going through this list of everything, all of a sudden here at the very bottom is the word tithe. And it was at that point when I realized I still need to give back. You see, when we travel, when we go through life, we have this concept of this right here is what I need to live off of. So that's where everything is going first. And if there's anything left, then maybe I'll put some in savings. And potentially, if there's a stitch left over, I'll give a little. Or we live with, you know what, I have so much debt, that's all I can do is haul that thing around. Going back to the very beginning of that debt, realizing that I was still tithing and still giving brings me hope. You see, what happens then slowly over time is you realize when we talk about this idea of living simply, this idea of less debt, more freedom, it feels impossible if you're sitting there with that burden. But I promise you it's possible to get out. The need for a mentor, the need for someone to pour into your life, the need for help. I was sitting down with Nathan Hughes. He gave me permission. He was talking about, hey, I'm strapped with debt. I said, you have a really nice truck. He said, yeah, I know. I said, get rid of it. He's like, what are you talking about? Get rid of it. He rode his bike to church this morning because he got rid of it. He's making good choices. What happens is instead of living, saving, and giving, if you decide, you know what, I'm going to give first. I'm going to save second, and I'm going to live with the rest. And that's going to start with a small little bit, but eventually it's going to shift. I need to be honest with you. Every time I go to Malawi, I still travel with the same bags. I still bring all this. The difference is this is filled with what I'm living on for 2 weeks. And I'm not exaggerating. Everything is in this. This now is filled with gifts and hope and joy. I have one guy every single year says, Paul, bring me Skittles. All right. Another guy saw that I brought Skittles to him. He's like, oh, bring me Starburst. I had Starburst once in America, greatest invention in the world. And so when I get there, the ABC students, the Live Love people, the Malawians all stand around and they don't look at me. They just like, yeah, he's got the bag. He brought it. He's going to hook us up again. It's all good. I would encourage you to realize that that is possible to do right now. As Josh talked about and Palmer talked about, adventurous giving. It radically can transform you. We go through life thinking that this is weighing us down, and yeah, it does. Get rid of it. Like you just got to make a choice and get rid of it. And as soon as you make that choice, you got to be committed to it, and you have to start giving. And when you start giving, lives change. God, thank you for this day. Thank you for the hope that you bring us. God, I pray that you'll be with the people in this room that are drowning right now. Allow us to stand around them and pull up the anchor with them. God, I pray that you will give us the strength and the courage to give more, to trust you with our finances, to get out of debt, and to realize it is possible to live 100% debt-free. Thank you for your hope and your truth. Amen.